Good morning. Here we are again. This should be the first of our broadcasts, and in it, we want to talk about the individual and what's the difference between stress and trauma and how we can help them. And we're blessed on our staff to have a substantial expert on the field, Stacey Leibowitz-Levy. Want to introduce yourself, Stacey?
Yeah, hi. I'm sure many of you know me. I'm a psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology. I work, I supervise in the trauma unit, and I also do supervision on staff at the Neve Family Institute. I also have a private practice based in Ramat Beit Shemesh. And yeah, that's kind of my background is an academic background as well. I worked at a university for many years in South Africa and have been involved in trauma institutes in South Africa for many, many years. And then when I made Aliyah, I was privileged to be able to join the Neve Family Institute and be able to at least apply some of my skills in the field within this institute.
Right. So we're going to hear from a true maven. Now, in Yiddish, it's just a maven, even if you're a woman. So I think, so Mavina maybe. So here we are in the middle of people freaking out about the corona crisis. And we want to think with our trainees mainly and with whoever else is watching about how they can be helpful to people in keeping the anxiety manageable or bringing it down if it's gotten unmanageable. So let's start.
Okay, so yeah, as you pointed out, we're in the middle of a rather unforeseen kind of situation where out of nowhere it would appear, suddenly people's lives have been turned upside down. Their normal routines are completely transformed. Their expectations for themselves and their families have to be readjusted radically, whether it's from how we're going to have a Pesach Seder or how we're going to make an income or how we're going to get through the day on a day-to-day basis. People are suddenly struck with and swamped with an enormous challenge and seemingly undefined and uncertain experience, which is very, very hard to define in terms of previous life experiences. You know, most of us don't have experience with some kind of, at some level, order and life-shattering event.
I think what you're getting at, though, is that,
yeah, go ahead, I'm listening.
When you live your routine life, when you have a routine and you see some sort of continuity, it's called expectations for the
Right.
that binds anxiety. That's not, it's life, but living a routine, living in a certain way, one of the things people do when they live a certain way is they take care of their anxiety. They live in a way that holds their anxiety.
And within that, we could even see it as a kind of, we live within a set of false, artificial assumptions, if you want to call it that. Most of us function assuming the world is safe, predictable, there's meaning and order to the world. And that's required in order to live normal lives and manage the regular normal anxiety of life. If we were to really kind of open our experience to the uncertainty of life, we would perhaps, it might even be normal for us to be immobilized by anxiety.
Right.
But in fact, that's not how life works. We establish a set of assumptions that kind of keep us safe, keep us in holding us in a bubble of safety and security.
Right. Actually, in the German-speaking world, the word for world is Welt. The word for the earth is Erde. Erde is the unexpectable. It's just, they have nothing to do with it. Welt, and I think it may be that way in Yiddish too, is the world you create around you. And everybody takes from what is around there that's chaos and creates something that makes life livable. And that's what's interrupted now.
Yeah, and then when you have this profound interruption, suddenly the kind of pegs that you hung your life on in the past aren't quite as reliable. Well, they certainly aren't quite as reliable. And that challenges people at multiple levels. It challenges people both in terms of their kind of going back to these core assumptions around their thoughts and frame of reference around their environment.
Right.
And it challenges people in terms of just the amount of dysregulation and emotional uncertainty that they feel inside of themselves, triggered by this new reality.
Right.
And obviously also at a bodily and emotional behavioral level, people are experiencing kind of intense shifts in what's required of them. And so we have this kind of unsettled, dysregulated, emotionally uncertain kind of space that people find themselves in.
And
Also
actually,
in the space,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Absolutely.
just to add it, because every now and then you drop something that's very important. So I just want to pick it up for our students, that the first place where we feel secure with regularity, routine, and expectation is our body. That's the first place that we hold anxiety. And one of the things we'll be talking about is how when you're overwhelmed with anxiety, you lose a sense of security in your body.
Right. So that's a very cool piece. Thank you for kind of highlighting it, that the whole experience of kind of reliability within your body for people who struggle with anxiety generally is not guaranteed. And similarly, when we're thrown into an anxious experience, we suddenly feel like we're almost in an unknown body, or a body that's responding in ways which unsettle us or don't feel like they're working in our favor. That's how anxiety feels. It's like, I want to be able to stay here and feel comfortable and calm, but in fact, my heart's racing and my palms are sweating and I feel distracted and I can't concentrate. And as much as I want to, it's almost as if those bodily responses I feel like an enemy. It feels like an alien experience, even within our own selves at a physical level.
Right.
So
we use the terms, for example, we use derealization when the world seems strange, and we use the term depersonalization. You don't feel that you're yourself. Those are signs of severe anxiety. But you're sort of adding another one, which is sort of like desomatization, like it's not your body. Whose body is that? It's not mine.
Right. I think also there is a piece where people can kind of feel detached from the whole experience. I think that's, and if we look at that in terms of stress responses, we do see those, either that we do have the fight flight kind of response to tremendous challenge or anxiety, and then we also have a kind of collapse or freeze responses. So for some people, part of what they experience is much more of that kind of depersonalized, distant experience, which also has its price, because they're somehow detached from their own experience. They're detached from their relationships, less present for their children, and less able to contain their own experience and their family's experience, simply because their way of coping is to check out. And for many people, there's a fluctuation between the two. If we, and even if we had to conceptualize this in terms of shifting from a more integrated depressive view on life to in Melanie Klein's terms, we'd call a paranoid schizo position, you can see often a shifting between spaces of kind of a position of total kind of worry, concern, over investment in, what's wrong? How am I going to cope with it? I'm going to get sick. I don't know if it'll affect me. What if it affects my family? How am I going to cope going into the future? Versus an alternative, which could be, this isn't going to harm me. I'm detached from this experience. I'm above this experience in some kind of way.
Well, we could add then, because you just hinted at another important area, that really, if you say, well, what is the continuity? Most people, their body does hold them. If they don't, we'll talk about that. But the next stitch in what's usual, routine, and expected are close relationships. And what you're hinting at is that when one person in a close relationship is not in the relationship because he's not there, in other words, he dissociates. So there's a price there for him and for people around him, because, people are saying, hello, if this isn't running the way it usually runs, are you there? And that's very stressful.
For sure. So there's a second layer of effect, if we had to call it that, in terms of also that whether there's detachment or a preoccupation with your own worries and concerns, either way, the person isn't present in their relationships as they used to be. And it's not like it's just me going through this crisis. It's potentially my partner, my children. So the whole kind of stability of that relational piece also becomes very challenged in
Right.
times like this.
Right.
Not to mention societally, we can see that, some people are saying, oh, some world leaders are kind of saying, oh, let's just kind of, kill off a few thousand more elderly weak people and kind of just carry on with life. And,
Right.
we shouldn't all be compromising ourselves in this way. Versus other people other leaders who are going to another extreme, perhaps, where they're feeling where they're feeling that they have to take very, very radical measures to protect society. Now,
Right.
what that creates, I'm not defining what is right or wrong in those situations, but what it creates in those situations is also a sense of not being able to rely on authorities or trust or be certain of the kind of external kind of pillars of stability, which most of us hinge our lives on. Most of us hinge our lives on certain certainties in our broader environment as well.
Right.
And those are very much being eroded by this current coronavirus crisis
Well,
as well.
you weren't in Israel for this particular scene, but it speaks to what you're saying. In the first Gulf War in '91, when the
Right.
first Scud missile hit Tel Aviv, the spokesman for the army was on television saying everything's fine, nothing's happening. But just in '91, it was possible to zap the CNN. In other words, we were just at the edge of globalization. Everybody zapped the CNN and saw this house in south of Tel Aviv completely destroyed. Completely destroyed.
Wow.
The missile hit the house and it was completely destroyed. And this guy was simultaneously saying everything is fine, and people were watching it. But what's really interesting about it isn't so much that, because, somebody thought that that's what they should do. They were wrong, but But what was interesting is it didn't decrease his credibility. In other words, this character, he's still around, his name is Nachman Shai, became the spokesman, but the sole spokesman. In other words, everybody identified with this person, and this person, even though he lied the first time, and you would say, let's just get somebody else, I think they made the right decision, that we're not going to find somebody else, and people will forget about the first missile, and so he'll stop lying. He only lied once in Israel, So, nobody questioned his credibility, I have to say, except me. But I shut up because I realized people wanted to have credibility, and he became the persona of the whole Gulf War, which was a couple of months, and it was in some ways scarier than the current crisis, because people were being told they were going to be gassed. Turned out that was also not exactly true. But they had this person that you could rely on. You saw him regularly, and you trusted him because he had nothing else to do except to speak about this. He wasn't involved in politics. He wasn't talking politics. He wasn't, a complicated figure. He was an uncomplicated spokesperson, and it worked. Everybody thinks it worked. The only person who didn't think it worked was me, so I shut up. But it did, for the population, it really worked. So what you're saying is that we need to have politicians, in some ways, people need not to have complicated figures speaking to them. They need to have somebody they can trust and rely on, and see the same face every time and react in the same way. Somebody who knows how to get you to do this until so you feel it.
It's kind of a feeling of take charge, that these are politicians we can trust, we can rely on, that they know what they're doing. And I think the reality is that there's so many unknowns in this current coronavirus crisis that they themselves are uncertain around what the right choices and decisions are.
Right, but there's a certain balance, because in the Gulf War we didn't know also which missile was coming. But there's a certain balance between speaking about uncertainty, and this we'll get to when we talk with therapists as well, between exposing all of the uncertainty and then trying to say something useful, or trying to say something useful and have the background is we're not denying the uncertainty, but here's what it's like the belt, that you choose a world. So people need the world to be created for them. What is the corona world? And I think in Israel, we're probably in the middle of a media flop. It's just not working.
Right, right. So certainly, I think the part of the corona world, the new corona world, is a world of uncertainty, where one has to, and where the kind of reality of unpredictability and unknownness needs to be somehow integrated in a way that doesn't unsettle people,
Right,
and that, like you're saying, when a politician speaks on a media platform, that kind of reality of that we are doing the best we can. We're trying to deal with tremendous uncertainty, and these are the action steps we've taken, is a much stronger position and a much more adult, mature, relational position than everything will be okay. We know what we're doing. Everything's under control.
right,
Or, you know, virus, what virus? Like, why is everyone overreacting? So kind of
right,
recognizing the reality and the uncertainty and engaging to the best of our capacity with that, and
right,
providing this spaces of structure and certainty where we can, providing guidance. That applies both at a societal level, but it also applies in the way we run our homes, in the way we communicate with our children, for instance, around this virus.
right,
Certainly children above 4, 5, 6. The reality of this uncertainty and its disruption to their lives is without a doubt very, very present for them. I'd say
right.
even younger. Little kids are kind of putting on their little ticks and going out into the Meerpeset and saying, "We want to go to gun." There's no gun to go to.
Right.
So
So that places parents. We're going to have a separate talk about, how to parent babies, little children, older children, adolescents. If we go back to the individual, could we take what we've said up until now and try to help our trainees to think about how it translates into their work with their clients remotely, mostly?
So there's certainly a parallel in what I've just said, I think, around the kind of demeanor or kind of stance that a therapist takes in relation to this issue. So,
Hmm.
of course, there's particular interventions or uh, approaches that one could use, and we can go into those. But overall, the stance of a position of I need to be able to tolerate this uncertainty for myself when I'm
Hmm.
sitting opposite this client. I need to have done my own work around my fears, my anxieties, my uncertainties, so that I can be present for my client in a way that's integrated, mature, not distracted, not coming from a place of my own countertransference. So I would say
Right.
that's the first step. It
So that in some
requires.
ways is like we were talking about the parent with the children. So a therapist has to pull themselves together in some way because they want to have a kind of presence that is integrating and helping the client become present.
Right, right. It's very hard to have a containing and holding presence yourself
Hmm.
if you haven't done some kind of work around coming to terms with the impact of this crisis, both internally and externally in your own world. So I would certainly say that's the first step for any therapist, and to be mindful of that, because there could be it's quite an ask, I think, in the sense that this is a societal wide issue. It's not like so I'm as affected by this as my client is.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
so, but on the other hand, this is the role, the position we're stepping into, and therefore it requires us to do some of that inner work around asking questions like, what about this crisis is triggering for me? Um, how do I want to respond to those triggers? What do I need in order to feel contained, held, safe in terms of my own life? And it could be that what's triggering for me might be issues of certainty, might be issues of power, might be issues of safety. And I need to respond to those within myself first. Also, things like creating, for me, for instance, transitioning to, I have used media video conferencing as a way of working with clients before, but not across my entire practice. So I think also creating with the person on the other end a sense of a new, containing, safe physical space in terms of the therapeutic space is also critical.
So let me just ask you, as a supervisor, let's say a therapist, a trainee, is saying, look, I don't have that presence. For whatever reason, I am not containing this well myself. And it's like the virus, I don't want to spread this to my clients, but I know that what you were just talking about, I can't do it. I'm not there yet. So, we would want to think about what we would suggest for a trainee to do in a situation like that, because they want to protect the client. On the other hand, there's some sort of a need for continuity, but spreading anxiety isn't it? Well, how would you think about that?
Right. Okay. So first of all, I think for many people, there's a space of needing to adjust to a new normal. So if we look at a concept of resilience or models of resilience, we all get hit, so to speak, by a new situation. And then for most of us with a degree of inner resource, which I am assuming most of us as therapists and people who are going into this profession do have a fair amount of inner resource, we bounce back, so to speak. We adjust to the new normal. So my sense is that for many of the people I was supervising, certainly in the first week when all these new restrictions started to come into place, and there was a realization of kind of this is a more long-term kind of thing that we're looking at. I think the first step is recognition that there's an adjustment phase, and that yes, within that adjustment phase, your levels of anxiety, your levels of distress may feel overwhelming simply because, I don't know, you have five little kids at home. You can't imagine where you're going to see them, where you're going to see your clients in the laundry room, but how's that going to work? How are you going to find the privacy to do it? How are you going to do that when your husband's at home, when he's needing to work, when he's using the computer you need to use? So both at an internal level and an external level, there's a tremendous amount of disruption stepping into a new kind of impact to one's life context. And then there's a reconstituting of some kind of new normal. So the first step I'm saying then in relation to a trainee who would feel that way is perhaps to recognize that actually it might not be realistic for you in this particular week to start with your clients, because you need to stabilize yourself, your family, your home, your broader ties. To some degree, you need to adjust to this new normal before you engage with your clients.
In other words, the trainee might engage their supervisor in a resiliency kind of conversation about,
That's right.
Case, how do I do it? It's not deep psychotherapy. It's
no. And the resilience tags or the issues around resilience are things like emotion regulation. What are my broader goals and purpose? How do I want to actualize my vision in life? How does doing this work align with that? How can I create structures in my life that ensure some degree of stability and certainty for myself?
Right.
Those are the things which reinstitute stability for a person. And my sense is that it's kind of more of a practical discussion for most of our trainees, in the sense that people doing this training are not profoundly fragile individuals. They have the resource. So it's a matter of grounding people back in those resources and kind of tying them, giving them a sense of tie or connection back to those core motivating pieces that maintain stability in their lives.
I mean, if we remember ourselves as trainees way back when, there's a certain crossroads that you pass at some point. In other words, when you're in training, at the beginning, meeting with clients makes you more anxious.
Right.
You don't know what to do and you don't understand. And, it's important for supervisors to remember that after you reach a certain point of security, seeing clients makes you less anxious. In other words, there's something about our routine as therapists, there's something about helping somebody else, there's something about a mutual presence that is energizing for us. Therapists who stay with doing therapy don't hate it and dread every session. The opposite is the case. We come out of a good session or even a questionable session feeling energized, but our trainees don't necessarily. And so, it occurred to me, and I want to know what you think, that somebody who says, I'm not ready yet, because I agree with you that it takes time. Resilience isn't an elastic band. Book, and there's resilience. Even the word resilience in the metal chemistry doesn't refer to something that's immediate. So it's somehow translated. It wasn't the Hebrew word for it. It's translated as chosen, but chosen is not resiliency, because chosen means something doesn't get in. And resiliency means it gets in and it's worked, it's absorbed.
Right.
With resiliency, it's a very important word. It's been around in the field for about 30 years or so. It started, I think, with Michael Rudder and his work on resiliency in children in the 90s,
Right.
even 80s. So if we say to a client, look, right now you're thinking about your own resiliency. When when that's settled, then have sessions. Until it's settled, don't have sessions. Call your clients, ask them how they're doing. Say you're not quite ready yet. You're going to get set up. Don't explain why. And wait.
No, I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying certainly in that initial adjustment period, a person can view things in this light. But then again, one has a professional role. That's my role. I'm a therapist, and part of my role as a therapist is to define and identify ways that I'm able to contain my own anxiety. And this doesn't just apply to coronavirus. It can apply to, I'm working with a client and she starts to talk about miscarriage, say, for instance, and I have my own history of miscarriage. That could generate anxiety for me, hearing about her speaking about this. What am I going to do in order to maintain a containing presence for my client, even when my own anxiety starts to escalate? So I'm talking more around that initial adjustment period. For me, that means maybe delaying from a Sunday to a Thursday. It does not mean saying I'm not going to see my clients. It means I need perhaps a little bit of time to get my own house in order.
So it's really a crucial training crossroads for people to it's that empathic loop that you figure out who you are in your client's eyes, what your presence means to them, and to be sure that you create the presence that's helpful for them and not something that's
right. And that requires you to perhaps extend beyond, I'm just I feel like such a heap of anxiety myself. How on earth can I see a client? To this person needs me to be present because I serve a certain function in their lives. I have taken on a certain role. And so therefore, I'm going to ensure that I hold on to my own anxiety, whether it's through breathing. Again, we can go to these rather simple techniques, which can be very, very effective. Breathing techniques, writing down the sources of my anxiety, both before and after a session, for instance. Visualizing myself stepping into a session, feeling calm and contained, creating structures around myself and the therapy that do feel that way. So in other words, making sure my client is in a private, contained, comfortable space when she's seeing me, and making sure that I myself have created some kind of private, contained, and comfortable space for seeing my client. Whether that means I now see my clients at 9 o'clock at night as opposed to 10 in the morning, or whatever it might be, kind of thinking about containment and stepping into an empathic connection with another human being in a kind of intentional and dutiful way, because I'm kind of saying that that's part of what we're required to do. I'm sure the guy who goes to the coronavirus ward, who's a nurse or a doctor, is experiencing way more anxiety than I'm experiencing when I'm talking to someone across Skype. but he knows that that's his role at this particular point, at this particular juncture, and
But
and therefore he steps into that function.
I want to recommend to people who are listening to this tape to stop it here, roll it back, and listen to the last 2 minutes a couple of times. Because what you did is you just rambled through an extraordinarily deep approach to how people pull themselves together. And so you just got the headlines, folks. And if you can translate that, and each of you find what among that those things that Stacey was saying can help you, roll back, listen to it again, and there's a pretty complete. You just rolled it off like simple, but it's very deep. That particular list of things that you can do. It's about creating a world. Now, the other thing that I think is worth maybe mentioning here is that when we talk to clients about anxiety, there's what's happening about anxiety, and what's happening in the room. In other words, one of the important functions of a therapeutic session, which has continuity, is somewhat expectable, right? It's the same two people talking, is that it treats anxiety online. In other words, you're creating this kind of way that people communicate, which is the second stitch after your body. It's, the connections with other people. And when you have a productive conversation with somebody, you're treating anxiety then. Of course, then the question is, how can you make that happen, not just in the therapy session, but there's something not just about what else happens elsewhere, there's something happening in the room.
Right, absolutely. And that consistency and reliability of connection is all the more important in this kind of phase of history as such. That all the more important it is to have a regular, committed time with people who are struggling to, generally contain themselves and function even prior to this particular crisis. For some people, interestingly, the crisis is a bit of a relief. My one colleague once told me a story which really struck in my head. She said that she worked in a psychiatric ward around the time of 9/11. And on the morning after 9/11, she went to work. And there was a totally different atmosphere in the psychiatric ward. Clients were like light and kind of energized. And she was quite kind of very unsettled by this whole kind of energy, which seemed kind of paradoxical to what was happening around her. And she asked one of the clients, she went up to the client and she said, what's going on? Like, why, what's going on? Why is there this kind of joyful atmosphere here today? And the client turned to her and he said, well, for us, now the rest of the world is feeling how we feel all the time. Now what our normal has become the normal for everyone. So there's sometimes a relief in terms of for not very not well clients at all, in the sense of the abnormality of their reality is confirmed, or the normality of their abnormal reality is confirmed by the current reality.
Right. Actually, had she remembered the literature about the London Blitz in World War II, and neurosis disappeared. People stopped being neurotic when they were busy surviving.
Yeah, right. That's the other thing that kind of, although I must say for most of my anxious clients, this has not been a blessing at all. It's really not a blessing for people who struggle with anxiety.
Right. Well, this is a different situation. Let me try to pull you towards the body part.
Right.
Your part. And I thought that we could talk a bit about what's called what's it called? I'll remember it in a minute, but Francis Tustin's way and Ogden's way of thinking about the way that you feel the body's falling apart. And do you want to take that up, or should I explain it and then you'll tell us how people deal with it?
Right. Okay. Maybe give a little bit of an introduction, and then I can take.
Well, you mentioned before the paranoid schizoid position, and paranoid schizoid position among Kleinian theorists, that was like the bottom. And in the paranoid schizoid position, it's all or none. It's black and white. You can't see. You can't see any sense of diversity, any sense of gray. And for those of us who are learning family therapy, the differentiation is very low because you can't co-create. It's all about regulating. It's all about getting people to do things. And then in dealing with trauma, people start to realize that there's another position under that. And that position is one where you feel that your body is falling apart. And when you feel your body is falling apart, you have to create a kind of a shell to hold it together. Frances Tustin experienced it first with certain autistic children who she was able to treat with psychotherapy. It's a minority, but it's there. And she learned from them that they have this experience that it's as if their kishkas are coming out, like their soul is going to be spilled out, and their skin is not holding it. So in order to hold that kind of experience of being annihilated, they would do something to make the skin stronger, something like that. Sometimes on me, and sometimes on you, and sometimes on the wall, and sometimes. But those experiences were ones that made the skin feel stronger and more able to hold the anxiety. And then she started to realize, and people with dealing with trauma started to realize that that's an important situation. It's not so unusual when people are very frightened. They go into that kind of situation, which is not with words, not with thinking, not with communications, all alone and in the shell. And that part of some of our clients will probably be feeling that some of the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So for clients who have that level of experience, one has to think very carefully. First of all, if you're now working on Skype or long distance, whatever medium, with a client like that, you're working with someone who's essentially has a very loose sense of an inner self, and as such, part of what you're wanting to do, I believe, with those sorts of clients is help them to strengthen that shell for now in ways that are helpful to them as opposed to destructive for them. So in other words, you want them to recognize the functionality of that shell as a protective, defensive mechanism, and that just make choices, so to speak, around perhaps that given the current context and situation, the most helpful and adaptive thing that a person could do is to sustain that shell in a way that feels least alienating and least self-destructive. And that's certainly the way I would think about something like that at this point, because of the profound lack of safety in the environment for a person. And probably the construction of that shell happened, or the kind of most functional points at which that shell was useful was when the environment felt profoundly unsafe and out of control. Right. So people will regress to these, even if they are not stepping into that shell all the time, so to speak. You might have a client you've been working with for a period of time who's able to engage more with you, who's starting to become more aware of other ways of relating. And you might find that they present now in a way which feels much less where you felt they were at a certain time, because they've shifted back into more primitive, defensive measures as a response to a more threatening external environment.
Right.
I feel one needs to come from a space of recognizing that and help the client to understand that decision and appreciate the functionality of that decision and respect that defensive strategy. And as I said before, help the person to make their choices around those defensive strategy as least disconnecting and as at least destructive to themselves as possible.
Right. I now remembered why I couldn't. I both remembered the name that I couldn't remember and why I couldn't remember it. It's a terrible name. You know, sometimes people are very good at describing things, but they use the wrong words. So
Right.
this was called, instead of schizoid paranoid, which is bad enough as a term, it's called the autistic contiguous. It's just a terrible.
Right. So that's a good reason not to remember. Yeah.
The idea is the shell. You know, forget those words; they're not very
Yeah,
helpful.
yeah, that just shows you also the power of metaphor, you know, that we can get lost in words, but when we have an image or picture, that kind of embodies something so much more powerfully than we could ever imagine. And you would never ever forget the shell, but you may well indeed, as you just illustrated, forget autistic contiguous.
That's very true. So forget everything except the shell. That's
Right.
what there's an interesting paradox about the shell, which is we're thinking about both clinically and even in terms of brain function. Um, the shell is a shutdown. We're all in a shutdown now. We hope the state is not in a shutdown, but people are, it's a shutdown. When the shell takes over, you don't feel you're making the shell. It's making you, and it's inhibiting you, and you can't think, and you don't have words, and you can't communicate, so you're all alone. And the interesting thing about talking about the shell is that you're changing that as you talk about it. Because when
Right.
you hear about the experience of being in the shell, the person who's talking to you is using words, and he's thinking, and he's communicating. And the other thing that Ogden pointed out, which I find very important clinically, is he said the part about the isolation doesn't get communicated unless you let yourself feel when you've been in your shell. And he gave some experiences about when he had an exam, the exam, doing some sort of crazy thinking about how to get through an exam. In other words, what he was saying is, and this is sort of a different way of looking at it, that the shell or the autistic contiguous, the schizoid paranoid, and the depressive are states of mind, and that they're normal states of mind. In other words, that everybody has aspects of all of them. And so when a person talks about a shell, you have in Israel, it's easy. All you have to do is drive for 10 minutes, and someone's going to cut you off, and you'll feel like you're in the shell for a second. So it's everybody has those experiences.
Right, right. One can shift into these very defensive spaces.
I actually think that may be easier to communicate virtually than in a meeting, because here we are talking, but we're looking close up. We wouldn't be speaking so close up, but
Absolutely.
the fact that there's something that in the first newsletter that I sent out to the trainees, I suggested that there's some enhanced intimacy in working virtually, because it focuses only on the voice and the face. And the last
Right.
we were able to
Absolutely.
just be focusing just on the voice and the spaces when we were nursing or something like that. After that, there's a whole lot of other inputs going in. So I think it can be communicated virtually as well. Probably it's not ideal. When this is over, we'll go back to seeing people. But I wouldn't say that it couldn't be communicated virtually as well.
For sure, for sure. I would totally agree that you would want to be communicating that virtually. I just think one would have more respect for the defensive position when one's working virtually, because the ability to contain a client who becomes overwhelmed emotionally, abreacts, wants to harm themselves, finds themselves totally uncontained. Uh, you That's very restricted in a virtual way of working. And when you have clients who are familiar with that shell space, often what's inside or what they're protecting themselves against can be profoundly overwhelming for them. So I would not want to take a client like that without a lot of thought into a space of overwhelm. I certainly would agree with you, though, in terms of the intimacy of working across a video platform. I've certainly experienced it with my own clients. That there's something quite disarming about this interaction in a way that one doesn't feel necessarily when when working in an office space.
Right.
There's something more intimate. In fact, what the article I sent through, the one article I write from my perspective, a more personal perspective of how I experienced working via video, as in some respects, kind of disarming perception of the client. Sometimes you see things in the client that you don't normally see, like their vulnerability, or even the fact that you're seeing the client in their home has an interesting effect on the therapy. I've certainly seen that. Say that again. I didn't hear.
Sort of like a home visit, a virtual home visit.
Right. Yeah. It's like I had one client who's so delighted that I can be with her in her home. That's how it's almost like a wish fulfillment for her,
Right.
which obviously I need to work within the therapy. But at some level, it's a very, you also see people you're less put together in a way. They haven't had to go out to get to you. They're relaxed. They're on their couch. They're wearing a snood or what, rather than a shaitel. It's a very, very interesting experience, and it, as you say, it can bring its own richness and its own opportunity.
Now, if
Certainly.
let's say a client starts to freak out while they're talking in a virtual session, you have some thoughts about what can be done? Because we want our trainees not to be too afraid of that. Might happen. And so we want
So
some
say that again. If a client starts
to freak out. In other words, they start to go into overwhelming anxiety at the time.
Right. Okay. So first of all, the whole issue of creating the environment from the outset, the therapeutic space. So in other words, making sure, am I seeing you in a safe, contained, secure place? Am I meeting with you at a regular hour, the same hour every week, just like I would expect to meet with you if you were coming to my office? What is the ritual around who phones in and who receives the call? I personally feel the client should phone in just like they would knock on my door and come into my office. I expect them to phone in to me when they're ready to call. So those things create already a physical space of containment, and especially for clients that are inclined to feel overwhelmed or profoundly anxious at times, those physical points of containment are very core and critical. If you suspect that if you have a sense of a client who's more inclined to overwhelm, I would perhaps start to put in place right now various techniques around grounding and soothing resources that you have at your disposal in the event that the client were to become anxious or overwhelmed. So almost like emergency, how would we put it, like, the escape hatch. No, that's not the right metaphor. It's more like like a resources. Simply, let's just leave it at that. Resources that I know I can use if I have to, that either shared language with my client around resources and stabilization, that allow me to know that if the client were to start to feel overwhelmed, I have these mechanisms at my disposal. So first level kind of mechanisms of that nature would be body-based mechanisms, such as breathing techniques, grounding techniques. Tell me a little bit more about your environment. Feel yourself in the chair. Where are your feet? What does it feel like to sit on the floor? Notice your body and feel your legs, and put your hands on your legs, for instance. These kinds of techniques. A technique like this, where there's a self-hug kind of, self-embrace kind of method. Techniques such as tapping methods also, which are, the evidence base for that obviously is uncertain, but more than uncertain, but but certainly I found it useful as a grounding, stabilizing, body-based technique for clients.
Where would people learn about those tapping techniques?
So just look online. You could very easily find something about tapping. It's called tapping, and it's simply, say for instance, someone is feeling anxious. You might say, even though I'm feeling anxious, I know I can cope. Even though I'm feeling, and at the same time, you're tapping and there's various meridian points at which you tap, and those help to ground the person and soothe them as well. I'm just thinking of what other body-based things, like for instance, having squeeze balls, cold drinks, hot drinks, working out with the client what are the body-based signals which help them to self-regulate, soothe, and calm themselves. And it can vary. Like I'm giving you for one of my clients, she comes into a session with ice water. That's what she needs. You know, with someone else, there's a squeeze ball, which could be very effective. For other people, breathing techniques. But just building that awareness for the client. And by the way, that's a resource that's going to help them out the room as well. We're talking about anxiety, which might overwhelm in the session. But, you know, given this whole context of the coronavirus, it could be very well that when they start to feel bodily anxiety, I don't know, as they're standing trying to give their kids lunch and their baby screaming and this and whatever the scenario is, that they could squeeze that squeeze ball, or they could you know, breathe to self-regulate and to soothe themselves. So these are techniques that could be useful if anxiety were to emerge in a session, but they're also profoundly useful for a client in many, many, many other areas of their life, and certainly won't go to waste. So those kinds of body-based techniques, you can extend those, for instance, into practices such as yoga practice, or you know, or, you know, more body based kind of physical practices that also help a person to feel grounded and regulated.
Well, you know, let me just add another thought here. It's one that I haven't thought of before, but you know, and when people used to do guided imagery, and people still do it, and in Israel, that's all people can do, because there's a huge limitation on hypnosis. So all you can do is guided imagery, unless you go to some expert who somehow is the only person you can learn hypnosis from. So, but when people did guided imagery, a lot of times what they did is they gave tapes, and you know, the person would listen to them.
Right. That's what I do a lot. So that's that. I was going to go on to the next stage, which is, so we've looked at this body-based aspect, but now let's think a little bit about how we start to self-regulate around thoughts, around inner world, around visual. For many, you know, we speak about thoughts, but for many clients, thoughts lead to image or picture. So I'm going to die as a thought is it's a frightening thought. But if I'm going to die and I now have a picture of myself dead with, you know, my corpse spread across on the floor, whatever it is, that becomes much more powerful. And certainly for in my experience, anxious thoughts are more often than not accompanied by strong visual images and pictures. So what we want to start to do for a client is also start to create a kind of core sense of safety, and certainly which can kind of counter not just thoughts which aren't helpful to them, but also things which might manifest at a deeper level, such as in imagery or fantasy. And so for me, a guided visualization is a profoundly powerful tool. I find it incredibly useful both as a relaxation tool, but also as a shifting. It has the potential to really, I don't know, shift people at a more internal place. I think more than in an inner world space. And so one would help the person to create a favorite safe place. For me, for most more functional clients, I allow them to do that themselves, you know, just with prompts around sensory cues that they may be noticing. But sometimes for clients that are less functional, one may need to provide more meat to it. You know, you might need to talk about it beforehand. And for clients who are even less functional, it may not be a good idea at all, because their reality connection is too tenuous and they need something more concrete. So then they could have something, a favorite soft cushion or a favorite soothing image or picture that they have on their wall. for some clients, that might be more secure as a kind of connection to a safe place.
Right.
And then, of course, the reality of recording that is I found that tremendously useful. And I will often say to clients, listen to this twice a day if you can, listen to it when you're feeling anxious. You can have headphones on, you can keep this running while you're going around your normal life if you need to. And it generally, what it does, I think, is it expands the window of tolerance for people. We haven't gone to those kinds of concepts at all, but in other words, their baseline level of life experience, their ability to tolerate anxiety becomes expanded by feeling just more safe, more calm, and more grounded. And it's internalized through repeated listening, as opposed to just being a once-off experience.
So what would you think, for example, if you were my therapist and I was a client and I was starting to feel anxious, and you said to me, listen, let's do the things that we know are going to help you, and you put it together the way that you put it. And I said to you, would it be okay if we record this, which could be a video recording or an audio recording? In other words, we're having the session on Zoom. So you just press a button and
Right.
then I have you with me when I need it. You're going to help me now, but I'll have you with me when I need it when you're not here. What do you think about that?
Right. So, I mean, I think that would be something that one would have to explore with the client, what that means to them and how, what function that's serving for them in their lives and what it would feel like for them not to have you around. I don't think that, it's not, I don't think one would want to necessarily encourage for all clients, for clients that kind of, recording of sessions as such. But that's very different and distinct to saying I'm recording a specific guided visualization, which is going to be helpful in particular ways for you. It's not that you need me to contain you. We need to build strategies that are going to help you to contain and soothe yourself. And so I want to help you to do that. One of them is a guided visualization using my voice, but it could be that I even find an online guided visualization. It doesn't necessarily have to be about me, but certainly I do think clients do internalize their therapists. There is that very profound relational piece that we are internalized as inner, soothing, holding, containing parental figures.
Yeah,
But we want that, yeah.
I think for
Go
some,
ahead.
it's a little frightening to have you hopped into the telephone of the
Right.
But for a client, when we talk about internalization, that's something that happens slowly over time. And
Right.
honestly, it's easy to work with. They remember the session. So they would remember, if I were your client, I would say, I'm starting to freak out and I remember what we did. And this is what Stacey would have told me. And this is how I'll take care of it. But there are clients who, whoop,
Right.
and it's something I think worth thinking about, because while we're doing something we're doing it and it can be recorded. So,
Right. So again, it depends on the function and the purpose and the client's level of functionality. So, certainly, I have had instances, I do have clients where they record sessions. And I think it's been very helpful for these clients to do so.
right.
But it's then, what is the therapeutic purpose of this? Is there a therapeutic function to this? And if there is, yes, there may be a place for that. But it's also, we want the client to trust in their own resources and their own capacity to manage and to draw on what they've gained through the sessions. I mean, there are also other levels that we can start to contain people's anxiety, like starting to look at the thought processes around the experience of anxiety. But one wouldn't do that in a situation where a person is feeling overwhelming anxiety. because what you're really trying to do is get to a stabilization phase. They're probably very unaware of their thoughts at that particular point.
Right.
It becomes more bodily
So
and sensory and overwhelming, and you want to go to that bodily sensory place.
right. If we think out loud about what we're imagining goes on in the brain, because the brain is becoming more of our friend in psychotherapy over time, then
Right.
you've raised basically two issues. One is synesthesia, um, that every experience is magnified and deepened when more sensory modalities are involved. So, for example, you were saying that, talking about something and visualizing it are quite different because the words are left brain function, and looking, visualizing is more of a right brain function. And the connection of emotion is
Right.
to visualization, is to the right brain, not, and then it goes across.
Right.
So a lot of times when people talk, as we say, paka paka paka, nothing gets through. But when you see it, it's simultaneous.
Mm-hmm.
And,
It's very different.
much
Right.
stronger. So, but what you were suggesting is that all of the sensory modalities could be enlisted, and they become uh, uh, um, a much stronger, more coherent. It's sort of like ego building because it makes a person feel more coherent. For example, if you say, "Well, there's that's touch, right?" And then there's that's it's rhythm, and there's moving of your arm, and there's visualizing, and there's words, and there's breathing, and then you might not. You mentioned something
Absolutely.
about taste, and one of the things that's least appreciated but terribly important is odors. In other words, if you take the whole
Mm-hmm.
experience together, most people think that something like lavender or there's another one, I forget what it is. But if you use these nebulizers to have a certain kind of an odor, that the part of the brain that's least mediated is odor. What smells in your
Right.
nose
Right.
is
Goes straight.
taste as well.
Sure.
And so that has a certain power to it. And so we're trying to pull together everything, using all of these sensory modalities would be as many as possible, right?
For sure, absolutely. We want to invite these senses, which at the time when a person is starting to feel overwhelmed and anxious, are being kind of alerted to threat and danger and to overwhelm. So in other words, just like I take in the anxiety through all my senses, I want to invite all my senses to counter the anxiety or to offer another experience of the anxiety. I think there is another piece which overlooking, or which I feel would be helpful to consider, and that is when you don't work so hard to fight the anxiety. So in other words, when we can just be more of that whole mindfulness kind of space, where there's a kind of sense of, yes, I'm feeling overwhelming anxiety, but this is a wave. I can ride this wave and I can survive this wave. It's just anxiety. It's just a feeling that's curious to me, that's interesting to me. I notice it. I don't kind of tense up. I don't react to it as a threat. And therefore, my whole experience of it becomes very, very different. But again, that's not crisis mode. That's that's more high functioning clients that you can use that kind of
Right.
method with. And it can be very, very effective. I've used various images and metaphors for that. I worked with someone yesterday, and we spoke about anxiety. We spoke about emotion as a stream. That was her language, and that she felt that we could start to think of the anxiety as some rocks on the floor of the stream, or a series of rapids where it destabilizes, but the stream continues. That there's no threat to the stream. It's just anxiety, or it's just sadness. It's just a feeling. Other imagery that's useful is it's like waves rushing against your legs. Or I had one woman I worked with where she said it's like on Shabbos when she's trying to cook and her little children are just walking around her, but she's so focused on the cooking that the kids don't really get in her way. And so for her, that was a helpful metaphor to think about in terms of anxiety. So
When,
sometimes we don't fight it. Sometimes it's about um, recognizing that it's tolerable. And anxiety cycles build in terms of avoidance and tension. So if I don't feel tense about the anxiety is naturally going to subside. Whereas if I feel tense or I try to avoid it, it's naturally going to spiral and spiral and spiral. So those methods are working at reducing that spiral, at reversing that spiral, through not escalating the person's response to experiencing an unpleasant sensation of anxiety, which at the end of the day is all it is for most people. Obviously, there's a difference when you start to see people decompensating and abreacting.
Let's think out loud about a couple of things that you said, because a lot of times, you say things that I think may be helpful to unpack also to see it, to see what's been said here. Let's take the image of the stream going over rocks. It's a very, very useful image. Like myself, who use hypnosis, I often find that people have those images, but it's worth thinking that when that person uses those words, there's a stream and there are rocks, she is probably seeing them, hearing it, feeling it. In other words, when you're dealing with anxiety, when people start to use an image, you want to enlist the other senses, and that becomes much more powerful.
Absolutely. We can enhance that imagery in all sorts of ways. You can get a person to draw the image. You can get a person to find pictures which embody that image. You can engage the senses in terms of really using it as part of a visualization, potentially.
Right.
So, certainly I'd agree with you there.
As we're training therapists, we are such left brain freaks. We use words that come from Greek and then we have to explain them. We can't even remember them. And by the way, aside from language, bergamus, at my age, it comes, 30 seconds after I try to the sense of bergamot or lavender seem to be helpful. Anyway, but we're left brain freaks and we try to do concepts, which is valuable. But in the room, there's this brain that has all these senses, and that we sometimes don't give ourselves room to say, okay, let's enlist. It's like the brain is a sort of an orchestra, and we keep playing the violins because that's what we were told.
Right. So let's invite all of the person's parts into the room. I think certainly that's and that's what the experience of all those pieces are involved. It's not just the orchestra, it's not just the violins that are involved in the experience of anxiety on the outside. So we want to invite all those components we want to enlist them in a process of also stabilizing, grounding, and soothing the person. That's much, much more powerful. Certainly for me, metaphor is a very core way of working with a person. And much more enduring, powerful, and memorable than having, I can discuss with a person how, you're describing so many ways in which your anxiety is overwhelming, or they can say to me, the anxiety feels like a heavy blanket that's wrapped me up and I can't move my arms. I have so much more information when they share a metaphor like that. And I have so many more potential resources. So what do we do if the blanket's wrapped tightly around you? How do we address that? How do we engage with that? It gives them access to a totally different level, as opposed to if I say to them, can you think of any strategies to manage your overwhelming anxiety? They'll go, I don't know. But if I had to say to them, what would it feel like to take that blanket off? What do you think you'd need in order to take that blanket off? I have a totally different level of conversation potentially, and a completely different level of accessing their inner resources that they might even be surprised of. They might be even surprised at.
That's what I think is so profound about the way you put it, that anxiety takes over everything. In other words, the conductor at this point is anxiety. Something's going on in the amygdala or something, but the amygdala has up the whole scene. In other words, the amygdala is inhibiting this, inhibiting that, and so
it's activated across all different areas. Yeah.
It's overactivated, and it creates a loop of activating itself. And then what you said, which was very important, is you can't fight against that, right? It's you like one of the Chabad rabbis said, you can't, fight darkness with a stick. You have to
Right.
work with what you're working. So you can't go against anxiety, but what you can do is start to elicit, to engage other parts of the brain that the anxiety is inhibiting, but you have more power than the anxiety because it's a relationship. And when you start to elicit those aspects, when you say tap, so that's an
Right.
experience. It's not anxiety. There's something else I'm doing that it doesn't belong to anxiety. So I'm already releasing part of my brain,
Right.
totality of the anxiety, and so the orchestra is starting to play some other things at the periphery, and then you gradually take over,
Mhm.
take the person to conductor. I'm using a metaphor.
Right, right. And I think what that also means is that the person starts to recognize that that they're not the anxiety. That in other words, the anxiety is just a small piece of this entire being or entity, and that they can shrink, so to speak, its impact on them. I'll often ask people to draw um, themselves and the anxiety, the relationship between themselves and the anxiety. And it's very, very interesting to monitor that, because at the end of the day, you don't just want to shrink the anxiety, but you also want to grow the person. You want them to start to see there's more to them. So we can use mechanism strategies to reduce the anxiety, but we also have to expand the person. Um, otherwise, otherwise we're doing a very kind of technical job and limited job in terms of helping a person manage their
That's,
anxiety.
that's the huge limitation of people using medication for anxiety, that it doesn't grow the
Right.
person.
Right. Then you're just shrinking that anxiety, which is a tremendous opportunity, if you're using medication to just disarm the enemy, so to speak, or weaken the enemy. That's a huge opportunity for then therapy to be part of that process, so that the person themselves can be expanded and strengthened, and form a different relationship to the anxiety and their experience of
You have
it.
experience with people having anxiety partners. In other words, it's like a shomer. It's the guy who's going to remind you to daven, and you're going to remind him to daven. So then you don't have to daven now. So
People who fuel each other's anxiety, is that what you're talking about? Like,
in other words, let's say that somebody says, "Listen, you have anxiety, and you have a friend who has anxiety, and if you have anxiety, can you call each other and remind each other?" In other words, when you feel that your orchestra is playing uh, uh, um, something that's horrible, you pick up the phone and enlist her orchestra, and she'll remind you, and then you remind her. Do you have any experience with that? Because I thought that might
I
fit.
have I haven't worked like that. Sometimes I've enlisted a partner, like in a relationship, um, where the couple come in and there's some supportive function there in terms of the partner assisting the client in terms of managing anxiety. But I can't say I've ever worked in that way you're describing before.
I think that it happens in nature. And sometimes, if we want to learn from nature, so all of the resources that we've talked about so far are personal resources. The next level is
Right.
call your mother, and she says, "Oh, you're having that that whirlwind again," a metaphor, right? And by just hearing that,
Right. Right.
to replace you grow the person. They start to feel.
Right. So certainly I've seen that, for instance, um, there was an example which came to mind for me. I've seen that with clients who create those kinds of supportive frameworks within their own lives, like a mother they speak to who helps to contain them when they feel anxious, or a partner who they'll talk through things with when they feel distressed. Um, so people do naturally, look for the broader interpersonal resources that are present in the environment, and I think that's a big strength. If one does incorporate that into in individual therapy, because the anxiety plays out in relationships as well. It's a nightmare to have a neurotic partner, so to speak. It's like, it's not very nice to, not be able to go out anywhere because your partner's worried all the time about, whether there'll be a bathroom or whatever the issue of anxiety is. So, that whole relational piece does become part of the work when one works with people who struggle with anxiety, as
Right.
it would, I imagine, we social beings, as we know at the Family Institute. So certainly a more full and comprehensive intervention would include
As
a
family
significant
therapists, I think that
relational piece.
these relational things have a temporary value, but they have a danger because what you're describing is something that helps somebody else that they need to take care of your anxiety, and so you need to have anxiety so they can take care of it. That's codependent.
Right, right. So there could
We
be a
want
kind
to.
of self-supporting cycle, he's strong, so I can be weak. I'm weak, so he can be strong, or whatever language,
Right. So we
whatever
wouldn't
the
see
cycle.
that as something that's temporary. For example, if somebody calls their mother, we don't necessarily want the mother to get addicted to why hasn't she called today? I need to have her, call me. As to start to internalize the mother, sort of imagine what
For
she would
sure.
say and bring it out of a relationship, so the relationship doesn't become also essentially part of the orchestra. That's
Right, right, right. But I mean, some people, one can get to a point where those relationships are used in a supportive and balanced way, not where it's a kind of dysfunctional kind of piece as well. But yeah, there is ultimately, you want to go to a piece where the person is able to regulate these things internally as an adult person.
right. And as we're heading to the end, I thought I might ask you about your experience and what you think about people using substances, particularly alcohol, when they're anxious.
So, people use various kinds of self-soothing mechanisms to regulate their feelings, self-medicating, if you want to call it like that, or a coping mechanism. It's a form of escape. But I suppose it also works at a bodily level in terms of just toning down that anxiety response. So I think certainly one needs to understand, the person needs to understand the function of these kinds of substances, and it depends where in the cycle of use of the substance that you're seeing the person. If it's a very established pattern already, there may well be already an addictive process going on, which needs to be addressed as a separate kind of entity. Often addictive cycles are related to some form of self-medicating in one way or another. So on the one hand, we want to deal with the underlying issue, but on the other hand, there may be aspects which need to be dealt with more in terms of an addiction model. And that can play out in all sorts of ways. People can be addicted to sexual relationships as a way of soothing anxiety. And generally, when you start to get to the root, when you start to speak about the anxiety and understand the root of the anxiety, which for me, in my experience, is often around fear of other feelings, fear around feeling overwhelmed by grief or sadness or hatred or rage. So when people start to own those feelings that often underlie anxiety, often one sees a dissipation in these addictive cycles. I can think of, particularly, I'm thinking of one person I'm supervising, where certainly the more the person's being able to own their less savory feelings, let's put it that way, the less reliant they've become on the addictive substance.
So we're in a
So,
that it was probably be worth our therapists being mindful themselves about what self-treatment are you engaging in, how is it working, and particularly I think that there's a danger that we're going to end up with more alcohol addiction then there was something on the internet that said, either I'm coming out of this crisis more mindful and 20 pounds thinner, or 20
Right. Or
pounds fatter from the alcohol problem. So
right.
it means, what you're doing to self-soothe. And we want to see people as looking for the things that help them to cope with anxiety, the self-treatments, but not to get stuck on some that are too good. For example, the problem with alcohol is simply too good. In 3 minutes,
Works well. All right.
you're not anxious and you're feeling good because it's a global gray matter inhibitor. It inhibits everything. Sometimes it inhibits
Mhm.
inhibitions and then you get violent. But let's say that it calms you out. But in 2 hours, you're going to need another one. And it's
Right.
important for people to realize that it doesn't take more than 2 or 3 drinks a day, daily, for 2 weeks. And we're talking about a crisis of more than 2 weeks
Right.
to be addicted. And the problem
Mhm.
with the addictions is that the anxiety that it was treating comes back double when you withdraw. So you have no
Right.
choice but to do more. So,
I mean, there's another side to this that with the lockdown, people have less access to their addictive substances.
right,
Um, so that's also going to generate certain crises in terms of how people have been self-soothing. Um,
right. Do you have any other thoughts about sort of self-treating and um, prevention before we wind up? What clients can be,
self-treating of what? Like, just explain to me what you mean. Prevention of what?
in other words, instead of drinking, what else can people do that helps them to get through?
Oh, right. So, um, I think there is an element of frustration involved in kind of being stuck at home and feeling so restricted, feeling and an element of amplification of whatever issues may be in your immediate environment. And I think people have spoken about this in relation to domestic violence as well. Um, that whatever the issue suddenly gets amplified when you're stuck in your four walls and you have nowhere to go. So if we were all highly evolved and developed people, perhaps this is a remarkable opportunity to face our demons and to really kind of wrestle with the things which that have been holding us back.
Mhm.
But for many of us, I don't think that would be an option. Also, because of the kind of anxiety this situation generates. It's not like we've kind of chosen to retreat at a Buddhist retreat somewhere.
Right,
It's like it's not a self-imposed isolation.
right.
So I think first of all, realizing and recognizing the complex feelings which get elicited by this, um, and providing um, kind of validation for them in terms of the right to be both seen, understood, and expressed, I think is very, very important. So to be able to express my frustration in a way which isn't going to terrify my children, but in a way which is going to release the energy of my frustration, is something important that people need to be aware of and notice. And
Right.
also to ask themselves, what, if we go back to kind of using a substance, what purpose or function is the substance serving? And are there other ways that this function or purpose could be served, which might be less destructive to me?
Right.
And even if there's small steps at that, even if it's, listening to music also gives me a certain level of soothing and escape. And you know what? I'm going to, instead of having 2 glasses of wine this evening, I'm going to have 1 glass of wine and put on some music and listen to that at the same time. That's at least offering some alternative whilst not invalidating the underlying need for containment and soothing. So one has to separate between the need and the function versus the action. And sometimes the need and the function are valid, but the action isn't the most helpful. So then one has to consider, what alternative actions could I take?
Right.
Um, as an example, the illustration I just gave.
Since you brought up music, um, it occurred to me that one of the things that therapists can be doing now is to think both about treating anxiety and about the way that you enlist the orchestra of your brain before you have anxiety. Because the more that you practice those things, and I think some clients may feel that it's a crisis, so you have to stop smiling and you have to be, serious. And to help clients to realize that music, dance, any kind of artistic experience.
Movement, dance. The more of our senses we can invite into working in healthful, supportive, cooperative ways, the more functionally coherent we can remain. So we can direct our senses toward things which are self-building, self-preserving, self-enhancing, as opposed to, if there might be a kind of slippery slide down into focusing on the negative, kind of feeling inactive, kind of moping around. And so there's an intentionality, I think, that's required about enlisting one's senses in sustaining a kind of contained, soothing, holding inner and outer space.
Sort of a corona routine, which
Right. The smell of cookies, vanilla, they always say the smell of cookies baking in the oven, listening to having a dance session together in the house with your kids or your family, listening to even maybe not, it might not even be such positive things sometimes, putting on a really violent piece of music, so to speak, and giving everyone the opportunity to just express those feelings in a little bit more of a kind of contained and in a bit less of a contained and restricted way, but still a safe way nevertheless. So giving opportunities to allow for a range of experiences for people, I think, is important, and using what has at one's disposal in one's home, whether it's like, obviously I'm from more of a female perspective, I'm looking at things like baking, cooking, music, art, small trampoline if one has in the home that one could use.
Say a word about humor before we wind up.
Oh, humor, yeah, for sure. Like, to me, that's a big piece as well, and we can see that as a form of coping across the board. I'm sure if anyone has a phone that receives SMSs, you're going to see the jokes that circulate all the time. So certainly humor puts things in perspective. It's an amazing coping mechanism. It's enlivening, not just at the level of our thoughts, but at the level of our bodies. We react, we laugh, we activate it. Our bodies move and are mobilized when we find something funny or entertaining. So certainly those forms of escape, which are helpful and help to trick our minds, if you want to call it that, or maybe that's not quite right, help to offer our minds alternative ways of seeing this, or kind of slightly nuanced ways of seeing this, or other angles, kind of anything which shifts you out of getting into this very stagnant, restricted space, because I think that's what humor does. It kind of like destabilizes. It kind of like shakes one up a little bit. One wants to encourage that. I think that's certainly a very, very helpful point.
In other words, the conductor is sort of eliciting different parts. And sometimes I think that when we finally get to look at the brain of a good joke, we're going to see that's the opposite of a convulsion. In other words, a convulsion is a sort of a reset, but it's by dissipating everything. And I think that the sort of heavy laughing that comes, especially if it's together with somebody, that it integrates things. It's a different kind of...
Right. It kind of just like, enlivens things and pulls things together in a way. And it's a relief. It's a release of tension. I do think, it's kind of a way of processing feeling, which kind of points to our fears, our anxieties, our insecurities, but in a way that feels empowering. A joke takes the ironies or the insecurities of what we're experiencing and turns it on its head. So that's an empowering experience in its own right.
So a therapist might be asking their clients as part of the corona routine, and what music have you listened to, and what dances have you done, and when was the last good joke that you heard? In other words, to see that.
Right. As part of the therapy, absolutely. Absolutely. I'd certainly see that as something one would need to consider.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last things you want to add before we wind up?
Well, I've enjoyed more. I've enjoyed talking more than I anticipated, which has been very. I've enjoyed the conversation. I found it stimulating and interesting. Helped me certainly to expand my thoughts around certain areas, and I feel that the whole space of I think what I'd want to say is that viewing life from a perspective of resource, from viewing our minds, our brains as a place of tremendous resource, that the client who can imagine disaster can also imagine tremendous possibility and tremendous potential. And if we can use our own inner resources and the client's inner resources in the service of keeping us stable, whole, healthy, alive, inspired, then I think we would be doing a great service to ourselves and our clients over this challenging time.
Thank you very much. Now you know why I'm doing these conversations, because that's what that does for me. So
Right.
thank you very much.
Right.
People, try to stay
Good.
well.
Thank you. You
Uh,
too. Be well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. All right. All the best.